coming out to hear us have a conversation about cross-sector leadership and collaboration. What I'd like to do is just honor the fact that you have a busy day and there are many things that you could be doing with your time. So I tried to formally present my thoughts in writing. So I'm going to do my best to convey that and really try to engage you in a conversation from there.
And I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. I forgot one point. Wer von Ihnen hätte gerne noch ein Übersetzungsgerät? Wir haben Simultanübersetzung. Diejenigen, die eins haben, einfach den blauen Knopf anmachen, der Sender schon eingestellt. Sorry. I just want to make sure everybody understands what you're telling us.
So for some time now, I've been under the impression that as I grew older, things would become less complex. I believe that time would grant me a perspective that only age and maturity could bring, a perspective that would magically somehow simplify life and its pursuits. But I have come to believe that I'm wrong. Life is not getting simpler, it's growing more complex. And it's doing so in leaps and bounds by the day. So I imagine that if you're like me, you also sense that the pace and the frequency of such complexity seem to come more quickly and more often. Recent events in Syria, in Turkey, in Egypt, and in countries around the world suggest that the challenges we face today are indeed complex. So I've come to accept the fact that I cannot change the pace or the frequency by which life becomes more complex or more complicated. So what I can do is to learn to thrive in complexity, and that is what my life's work has become about. So after more than a decade of thinking about, studying, and working with all kinds of organizations, I can say with confidence that something happens to us deep in our souls, individually and collectively, when our environment becomes more complex. I've observed patterns that emerge inside of organizations as their ecosystem becomes more complex and the interactions grow more complicated. In some cases, apprehension and uncertainty contribute to collective paralysis as groups struggle to decide how to respond. In other cases, individuals retreat inward, assuming a bunker-like mentality that often blurs our vision, heightens our sense of fear, and constrains positive forms of collective action. So to put it simply, what I see today in the United States is a lot of noise. Distractions that weaken our social bonds, that compromise our strategic plans, and have hurt our performance. So I want to offer you a few examples. In the United States today, we know we have big challenges that demand attention. And if we are to effectively deal with our broken immigration system, with the rising costs of healthcare, with our dependence on fossil fuel, we will need a new model for citizen engagement and collective action. But as you are aware, we are struggling to act. And I believe that our failure to act lies in our failure to establish a shared identity. For it is through a shared identity that we can begin to construct shared destinations and shared actions, and actions that are designed to get us to a better world. We're having trouble acting collectively because we do not have a shared destination. We do not have a shared destination because we have too many competing identities. And this problem is getting worse because those of us who wish to see something better are competing against a complex set of narratives that have increased the noise level, added to the complexity of life, and left us confused and divided. And I argue that the United States is not alone. You see this happening around the world. What we're witnessing today in countries around the world are simply modern-day versions of an ancient struggle over the proper relationship between public policy and social justice. There's an effort underway by people in countries all around the world to redefine that relationship. And I have begun to think of this as the Great Civic Awakening of the 21st century. Citizens, and even those in their respective nations who are not legal citizens, find themselves deeply disappointed by the status quo. The question I want to pose to you today is what narratives will emerge and how will those narratives shape the actions of citizens, NGOs, business, and government? How will the stories we tell influence the level of engagement and the sustainability of collective action that we so desperately need, especially if we are to deal with global challenges like population growth, climate change, war, and violence? So as I watch the events unfold in the streets, I'm growing increasingly concerned. To use the metaphor of music, the performances we often see today take place in chambered silos, and they're taking place without conductors. We are rapidly descending into a conductorless orchestra without an ability to hear, to integrate, and to harmonize the myriad voices around us symphonically. And there are several things that strike me as new developments, as potentially discordant notes. One is the sheer size of the inequality in our societies and the pace by which it is growing. The sheer numbers of people who are becoming rich in Asia and soon in South America and in Africa are mind-boggling. We are creating an international class of wealthy elite who will quickly develop transnational identities to go along with their transnational interests. Will they be able to, or even willing to, have a dialogue with the less fortunate in their communities? The second force that strikes me as important is the ability of those who are marginalized to connect with others around the world. The ability to use technology to raise the awareness of the deprived to the depths of their deprivation strike me as potentially transformative. And these are relatively new developments, and they suggest a prolonged period of uncertainty may lie ahead of us. But although I am concerned, I remain optimistic. We do not have to spiral down the path toward the edge of chaos. And I have spent the last decade attempting to understand what types of people and what types of organizations thrive in this complexity. After years of working with leaders and organizations in all sectors and across a variety of industries, I have a theory. I believe that organizations that thrive in complexity do so because they have a critical mass of leaders who are able to manage the fluctuations that occur between moments of complete order and complete chaos. These leaders never allow the organization to come to a complete rest along either one of these two poles. It's how they do this that has me captivated. Organizations that thrive in complexity do so by maintaining the group's loyalty to the fulfillment of a collective purpose or to the arrival at a collective destination, even when both seem unreasonable or unattainable. I call this process symphonic leadership because it represents a holistic approach to human interaction that is predicated on inspiring individuals to negotiate their personal agendas in a manner that can produce an extraordinary collective outcome. Symphonic leaders, through their mindset and their behaviors, react to complexity not with fear and uncertainty, but with a spirit of optimism and a sense of direction. More specifically, they possess a mindset that embraces three principles which I'd like to talk about. They see the impossible, they play from the soul, and they can move the crowd. It's this ability to gracefully manage collective loyalty in the midst of complexity, despite the negative forces to the contrary, that allow an organization to achieve extraordinary outcomes, no matter how complicated the environment becomes. So not only do we need symphonic leaders inside of our organizations, we also need them in society. We need symphonic leaders who are capable of constructing effective cross-sector coalitions that act collectively to unite us in pursuit of common values and a common purpose. So while the demonstrators in the street work out their own vision of the ideal, I'd like to turn the challenge to us, to those of us who work at the intersection of policy, profit, and philanthropy. What does our ideal look like? Will we know it when we see it? What kind of leaders will we need to repair the breach between the governed and those who govern? I believe the Great Civic Awakening presents us with a window of opportunity, an opportunity to create a process and a structure where business, government, and citizens can come together to develop symphonic leaders. One way we can do this is to articulate a new cultural narrative that casts leadership in a new way. And I will explain this in a minute, but let me at least stress the need for this type of leadership. There are plenty of models that deal with leadership as an act of both vision setting and strategic management. However, there are not many that cast leadership as an exercise in improvisation and mobilization, where leaders are defined by their ability to induce commitment and to inspire loyalty from every sector, what I call unleashing the whole of society. There's a special form of leadership that I describe as symphonic leadership that challenges leaders to creatively call upon their skills in new ways that effectively shape their environments. So individuals across sectors can interact in ways that foster the kind of commitment and loyalty to achieve something extraordinary. One way they can do this is through cultural narratives. So, what are cultural narratives? Cultural narratives are the commonly held stories that most people in a culture use, whether consciously or not, to understand who we are and how we should act. Cultural narratives explain our lives and they legitimate our assumptions. They constitute our worldviews. But the key for me is that cultural narratives shape the precondition for action. Let me give you a couple of examples. the narrative in the United States of American exceptionalism and manifest destiny is a story that tells of America's unique virtues and our divine destiny amongst the community of nations. It's a narrative that shows up in our elections. It shapes our debates. It influences our foreign policy. Yet, interestingly enough, we rarely apply it domestically. We rarely use American exceptionalism to push for a better society for the least among us. It is a narrative that symphonic leaders in the United States need to use to push for the kinds of cross-sector action that can solve our problems around intergenerational poverty, as well as the many other issues we face with education, healthcare, and the economy. There's a second cultural narrative we're struggling with in the United States. As recently as this year, the phrase earned success has been used to shape our discourse and our policy. Earned success means defining your future as you see fit and achieving that success on the basis of merit and hard work. It is a narrative based on meritocracy. And there are those in America who believe our country is built on meritocracy, where quality will inevitably rise to the surface. If you work hard enough and work long enough, you will succeed, they argue. And you can probably imagine how this narrative shapes our debate, our policy, and our willingness to act in a variety of areas. And the third narrative I'd like to suggest we consider is what I call faith through good works. And in the United States, we use a biblical passage from James, chapter 2, verse 14 through 26, that many use to justify their personal commitment to philanthropy. It is a story that suggests that faith without action is dead. And this is a dominant belief held by many American philanthropists. Charity is an extension of tithing. It is a public demonstration of commitment to Christianity. So why do I need to measure my impact if my actions alone are God's work? There are other narratives that exist in Germany, in the European Union, and beyond. But here's the problem, and I'm going to draw to a close. The point is not that these narratives exist. The point is that we have too many of them. And the ones we have serve to divide us. So in the United States, our cultural narratives are no longer widely shared across the country. They become regional. They become generational. They become partisan. Our cultural narratives are no longer fluid and emergent. They are becoming fixed and permanent. They are no longer shared and unifying. They are narrow and divisive. We need new leaders who can articulate new narratives that promote the value of strategic foresight, social innovation, and equity. Leaders who can see the impossible, who have the courage to play from the soul, and who have the skills to be able to move the crowds from all sectors of economy. So let me offer my own cultural narrative, one which emerges from my roots as an African American. Music lends itself very well to the concept of a narrative because it incorporates so many of the principles and challenges we face today. So let's say that music represents action. Music or action can be produced by a single individual, but it grows increasingly complex when it is created and performed by a group of individuals attempting to play in concert. So when you think of the word symphonic, you might think of an orchestra playing classical music in a structured, orderly fashion. And that is what we see today in the United States. Lots of different sectors doing things and acting independently, but rarely doing so in concert and in ways that produce extraordinary outcomes for all of our society. So I encourage you to think of jazz when you think of leadership. Jazz is the more appropriate metaphor for the type of mindset and the kind of leadership and action that we need today. Like jazz musicians, many organizations are forced to perform in environments where there is no formal score and where the tempo and the quality of play are determined less by a conductor and more often by external forces. Today, our organizations look like jazz bands where leadership is shared and where agility and improvisation are the expectation. Wynton Marsalis once said, "Jazz is an art form that can give us a painless way of understanding ourselves. The real power and the real innovation of jazz is that a group of people can come together and create art, improvised art, and they can negotiate their agendas where the negotiation itself is the art." So I argue that leadership is a negotiated art, and we find ourselves negotiating agendas in complex environments. As the numbers of contexts continue to expand, the world will need some masterful negotiators. It will need symphonic leaders, people who thrive in complexity, and in the process, leaders who are able to gracefully lead us into unfamiliar territory and still produce extraordinary outcomes. So I hope that you'll join me in promoting a new leadership narrative that promotes the value of cross-sector collective action, one that emphasizes a mindset and a set of behaviors that are inclusive, holistic, and harmonious. Thank you.